In the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, the third chapter, we run into a man named Moses who's out tending sheep in what the scripture says is the far side of the desert. I don't know how you do sheep in the desert, really. It doesn't seem right. I think usually when the scripture says desert, it means wilderness. But anyway, he's there, and he's really kind of in hiding because if you know anything about Moses' life prior to this point, you know that he is in a place where he wants to spend the rest of his life in anonymity. See, back in Egypt, where he kind of ran away from, the government wanted to kill him, and all of his people thought he was a traitor. So he really didn't have anything there. It was best to just get out of town and live his days out in that manner. So as he is there tending sheep, this bush catches on fire, and he sees it from a distance, and he's intrigued by it, so he wants to go closer and see what's going on. And he realizes that the fire is going, but the bush isn't being consumed. It's burning, but it's not burning up. And so he's very intrigued by it, and within a short period of time, a voice begins to come seemingly from that bush, asking him, telling him, that God is sending you back to Egypt to go to Pharaoh, the guy who wants to kill you, and demand the release of all your countrymen, and you're going to lead them. You're going to be their leader. He's saying you're going to lead the people who hate you, and you're going to confront the guy who wants to kill you. And Moses is going, no, that can't be. I don't have any authority there. What kind of authority do I have? And God begins to give him some authority by telling him who he is. And God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And that name for God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, became kind of the standard name throughout the Old Testament. Now, later in the Old Testament, God would give a personal name to himself, Yahweh or Yahweh, but people knew him by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there's two reasons. One reason, of course, is that in that day there were so many polytheists. Everyone was a polytheist. That means people who worship multiple gods. Theos is the Greek word for God, and poly means multiple. So these are people who worship multiple gods. In the Mesopotamia at that time and really everywhere. We still have it today in some parts of our world. And even when Jesus came in the kind of Greco-Roman era, the Greeks and the Romans both had many, many gods. So back in the Old Testament and even going into the New Testament, the Jews would identify their God when they'd say God and someone would say, what God? Who God? They'd say the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But there was another reason too. And the other reason was that every time they said the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they were saying, remember, God did some amazing things in and through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And it was them teaching themselves that it was important for them to remember what God had done and what God had done through people. This trellis that we're on during this, that we're growing into during this Lenten season, part of that trellis is the issue of remembering. Now, Abraham was a man who lived a very simple life in a place called Ur, and he had done what his family had done for generations unending. And one day he hears God say to him, I want you to leave the place you're at and go to another place that I will tell you about later. So leave where you're at and go to some place. Just trust me. You'll find out what it is. That's a remarkable thing to think of. I mean, for us, we don't think anything of people relocating, across the country or around the world. That's a known thing to us. That was totally unknown to them. No one ever traveled. They only moved around maybe to find better pastures for their animals, or if a well dried up, they'd move to another place to find a place of water. But no one left their family. No one left generations after generation, and no family would understand that. They would think they'd gone mad. And probably sometimes Abraham thought he had gone mad, but he did that very thing and left everything he knew. The New Testament talks about this. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. I love that verse. I don't know about you, but in my life, in trying to walk with Christ, there have been many, many, many times I had no clue where I was going. I kept following, wanted to keep following, didn't know exactly sure what that looked like, but I can identify with Abraham in going to another place and having no idea where you were going. In this journey that had all the ups and downs and all of Abraham's successes and all of his failures, all of his moral failings, all of those things, there came a time when God told him to get out of his tent and go outside in the night and look up into the sky. And he said, count the stars if you are able, which of course he wasn't able. And he said, that's your progeny. Those are your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. A great nation will come from you because you've obeyed. The problem was to have grandkids, you got to kind of have kids first, right? And Abram had none. He tried some workarounds, but they didn't go too well. He had this promise, but he was an old man. He and Sarah weren't mom and dad age or grandpa and grandma age. They were at least great-grandpa and great-grandma age and had no children. So how do you believe a promise like that? Well, one day, as they are going about their life, as it is in this new location, 3 travelers come by, and the travelers, they get a little bit mysterious as you go in the story, but they came by, and Abraham did what they did in that day. He just showed incredible hospitality. He said to those men, he said, would you please make yourself comfortable in the shade of this tree? I'll bring some water so you can wash your feet and kind of refresh yourself. He said, I'm going to ask my wife if she will get some flour and knead some dough and bake some bread, and then I'm going to go out, and he did. He went out and found a calf that would be very good to eat and brought it in to slaughter it and prepare it. And he said, I'm going to go do some milking and bring back curds so that we can have something to eat, and just really treated them with this great dignity and respect. During the course of this time, one of the travelers said to Abraham, I'm going to be passing this way again in about a year when I'll see your son. That was kind of a weird thing to say, but Abraham had this promise in the back of his head. Sarah was inside the tent preparing the bread, and Sarah's response was, she laughed. She said, are you kidding me? An old woman like me and an old man like him? One of the travelers said, why are you laughing? I'm not laughing. No, you laughed. No, I didn't laugh. A year later, when he came back, there was a little boy, and they named him Isaac. I love that name. It means laughter. He was named after his mom's lack of faith. Is that cool or what, I have a grandson named Isaac, and boy, he fulfills his name. He laughs a lot and makes us laugh a lot. So it's a beautiful thing. But this son Isaac was born, and he wasn't even supposed to have existed. And here he is, and then he has sons, one of them named Jacob. And Jacob, man, he is a piece of work. I mean, Jacob, he did so many wonderful things and so many terrible things. He had times when he was like a noble person and times when he was just a scoundrel and defrauding his brother, all kinds of stuff going on. But Jacob is known as the one who wrestled with God. There's this story, and can't go into the detail right now, but it's an amazing story about this encounter with a being of some kind, and he comes out of it, and Jacob says, I saw God face to face, and I lived through it, and I wrestled with God. And God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. And the word Israel means contend with God. So Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Abraham did what seemed insane to anybody of his day, and God did amazing things through him. Isaac should never have existed, and God did amazing things through him. And Jacob was such a mixed bag of good and bad, evil and wonderful, and God did wonderful things through them. And the Jews wanted to remind themselves of that every time they talked about God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Remembering remembering. Bible's full of biographies. I grew up in church. I grew up in Sunday school, and so I heard all the stories of people, Gideon, Samson, and Noah, and Ruth, and all of these stories. I didn't think much about it when I was a kid. Later on in my life, I realized that I think that's because our lives show us that God always does what God does through people. He works with people. In fact, I would venture to say that if you wanted to go through the Bible and say, what did God do entirely on his own, not using anybody else, you'd have the first chapter, and that'd be about it, right? After the creation's over, people get involved, and God's talking to people and using people and calling Abraham and that kind of thing. So in the New Testament, we have this book called Hebrews. It's written by Hebrew and written to the Hebrews, hence the name Hebrew. If you hear preachers preach from the book of Hebrews, they always call the author of Hebrews, when they refer to him, they call him the author of Hebrews, because we don't even really know who wrote the book. There's a lot of theories, but we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. So the author of Hebrews, and because of his deep, deep heritage, and because of the people he was writing who had the same deep heritage, he knew he needed to communicate to them through biographies. And so the 11th chapter of Hebrews is a series of these great biographical sketches of individuals. He starts out with Abel, and he talks about Enoch. He talks about Noah's faith. He talks about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And after talking about them, he makes an amazing statement. He says they were longing for a better country. But he wasn't talking about just better pasture lands. He said they were longing for a better country, an eternal country. Whatever that meant at that time, they were longing for it. After he says that, he goes on, he talks about Joseph and Moses and Rahab. People didn't want him to talk about Rahab, but he felt like he needed to talk about Rahab. She had a reputation, and it was important, he thought, for them to know that. Then he says what preachers always say, I wish I had the time. He said, and what more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received their dead, raised back to life again. And he gives this litany of all these people that these Jewish believers, they knew about them. And he said, remember them? Do you remember them? Do you remember the outcome of their lives? That's a healthy thing for us to do. When I was very young, a teacher introduced me to the importance of reading biographies. And it's a manner in which we can watch God do his work in ways that we can understand and comprehend because he does it through them. There's a whole lot of people in my life that I've never met. They preceded me, but in reading about them, reading their words, studying the way their lives turned out, the effect of their lives, they became my mentors. They became my teachers. We all have different mentors and teachers and heroes. So my heroes were St. Francis of Assisi, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., Daniel Berrigan, Doris Day, oh man, John Lewis. So many people that just inspire me. And they're like people who have walked with me because I've opened up to them. One of those I got to meet. None of those I listed, but there's one hero in my life, and his name was Tom Neese. He was very well known in the denomination I was a part of. And I won't go into his life, but he did some amazing things. He was one of those guys when everybody said, sit down, he stood up and changed life for many, many people. And I was invited to this thing in Indianapolis where we were going to have this roundtable discussion to try to look for direction on justice ministries for the denomination. And he was also invited there. And I was like starstruck. He's sitting across the table from me. And after we were done for the day, he said, hey, can I ride with you back to the hotel? I couldn't believe it. we jumped in my Mini Cooper and we went and talked and talked and talked and talked. And then a few years later, well, it's just a couple of years later, we were both at the same conference. And being the fanboy I was, I went up to get a selfie with him, And he said, hey, you want to do lunch? And I'm like, the Pope could have called me up and asked for lunch. I wouldn't have been more impressed. That's how I was so excited about him. And I asked him all kinds of questions, and he told me things I'd never read that he'd said before, and just it was so fascinating. I learned so much that I've taken with me. But the other thing was, he asked me questions, and he wanted my input and wanted to know how I felt about things, which just blew me away. And I realized it wasn't just what Tom Neese had done, it's who Tom Neese was. The things he valued and the way he made me feel so valued. Not everybody's heard of him. A lot of people have, but he's one of those that is invested in my life. But the writer of the Hebrews goes on. He's listed all these people that the listeners knew about. He's not going to talk about all those heroes that nobody knows about. What George MacDonald calls the unhistoric people, or those who led hidden lives, or those who were buried in unvisited graves. I don't want you to hear the awe and respect he has for those people that we've never heard of and never will hear of. He says there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning, and they were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went around in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. And then he says, the world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. And you know what? Probably none of us know people who have suffered in that manner, but all of us know people who lived hidden lives that nobody noticed how historic and how heroic those people were. They were people who lived out a life that did change the world and is changing the world, yet nobody knows who they are. 3 weeks ago today, I drove to Florida for a funeral of a close friend. I drove because I don't fly. That's another topic. That's why I think John Madden is such a great man. He just set the stage for those of us who don't fly. You non-sports fans have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay. I drove down to Florida, and my friend Joe, who I'd known for like 35 years, and we'd done a lot of stuff together when he lived in Jackson. He and I and a group of men and women, we started a nonprofit in town that is ended up feeding just scores and scores of people over the years. Joe was always on the lookout for the most vulnerable people. He'd spend hours and hours each week at Interfaith Shelter. He always had these ideas when we'd be in meetings. He'd say, hey, we could do this, and it would help so many people. Or we could do this. He was so visionary and creative and so optimistic. I mean, his optimism just put wings to whatever we were doing, and never got discouraged, even though that kind of stuff's very discouraging work. And we just saw so many lives touched because of Joe. At one point, they moved to Florida because of his wife's health and that kind of stuff. And we hated that they moved to Florida. But when he moved to Florida, they just started, right where they left off. And they found a church that had so many ministries that they could be involved in. Joe and Jackie spent a huge portion of their time over many years just helping people recovering from addictions, people formerly incarcerated, that kind of one-on-one stuff that no one sees and that doesn't have a 100% success rate, but changes lives. So I drive down for the funeral, and they'd asked me to speak at it, and I didn't officiate, but I was one of the eulogizers, and another friend of ours who did all this together with us, Terry Williams, he shared some things on video, and so we talked about Joe's Michigan days and all the things he did. And then those who knew him from his Florida days kind of talked about all the things he did. It was one of those funeral services where you just sense God's presence so palpable, and it's just a beautiful, tragic, beautiful thing. So after it's over, we go have sandwiches together in the fellowship hall and stuff. And the people who knew Joe from Florida kept coming up to us saying, We didn't know any of that stuff about Michigan. We didn't know any of that stuff. We kind of said, well, yeah, I'm not surprised. Joe wouldn't go around telling you what he'd done. And it was just another reminder that it wasn't what Joe did alone. It was who Joe was. He was a person who loved, who had deep compassion for the vulnerable, who had empathy and humility. And as I stood up there and talked, I saw a lot of people in that room as they were nodding. He was a hero to a whole lot of people. And you know what? He lived a life pretty hidden, pretty anonymous. I think that's what the Hebrews writer is trying to tell us, that there are so many heroes. I think sometimes we think there aren't heroes anymore. Look around. And as you look around and might see heroes in this room, some people are looking at you. He goes on in the 12th chapter, after he's given us this litany of all these people. No. And he says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. He's bringing this analogy together that they understood in the first century of the Greek games. The Greek games that would become Olympics, that kind of stuff. And he's talking about the races, the runners in the race, and he's talking about the great cloud of witnesses, and he's helping them envision that by thinking about the stadiums, the big, huge stadiums that were built in those days. Archaeologists found one stadium they think seated 100,000 people. That's the big house, right? And so he's saying, now visualize this great crowd, and you are the runner down there, and they are cheering for you, and they are excited for you, and they know you can do it, and they are just shoving you on with their words and with their thoughts and with their hearts. And he says, we have a great cloud of witnesses. He says, so let's run with perseverance the race and get rid of everything that would make us stumble. I was never a runner, well, until later in life, but then it was a jogger. I was not a runner. But I know I've been to enough track meets and that stuff. Runners don't carry anything with them except maybe the baton, right? That's it. They don't wear heavy clothes. They get those sweats off of them before they hit the track. They wear the lightest, minimal amount of clothes because they don't want anything to interfere with the race. And he's saying this, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Sometimes that's translated the author and finisher of our faith. It's the Alpha and the Omega of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and not lose heart. Now, he's not done with this. He's remembering all these people. He's encouraging us to remember. He's telling us that all those people we remember are still with us in a very real way, in a very mystical way. They're still with us. And then in the 13th chapter, he brings it all to fruition. Now, I grew up in the church, and there's certain verses you hear growing up that you hear all the time, and so they're just verses a part of you. And I remember hearing all the time growing up the verse, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Anybody ever grew up in church and heard that a lot? Yeah, very common verse. And I always thought it was just a theological statement that God never changes. And but that's not what it is. In fact, some people took it as a theological statement to say we should never change our concept of God. That's not what it's saying at all. Here, let me read the whole sentence for you. He says this, remember your leaders who spoke God's word to you. Imitate their faith and consider the way their lives turned out, because Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What he's saying is that we remember because what God did through frail, sinful, sometimes ignorant people who were faithful to follow, God still did amazing things through their lives. And it's important for you and I to understand that every one of us has that capacity. Every one of us. Some people are called to be louder, and some people will be known more than others. That's okay. He doesn't say some are better than others. Some of us, we will change the world by where we stand with someone. There are so many people right now in our country being marginalized and pushed to the edges, and sometimes all they need is someone to stand by them and put their arm around them and say, I'm with you. That's a heroic deed. It's a life-changing thing that you can do to people. Sometimes it's just a matter of sitting and walking with someone through difficult times. Sometimes it's just a matter of keeping up with someone with text saying, I believe in you. I believe in you. You're scared. I'm scared too. We're in this together. We're going. There's so many times that we teach, not with our words, but with our life, what it is to be part of the great cloud of witnesses. And so we remember so we can go forward. We remember what God did to us so we can be that to others. Let me just challenge you today at some time. Take some time today. Do it today or you'll forget. Take some time today and just think about your heroes. I'm guessing most of them are people that other people wouldn't consider heroes. They don't know them. Think about your heroes. They're frail, flawed people. But they were people that maybe even if they didn't know they were being heroic, in fact, I'm sure they didn't, they still invested something great in your life that you will invest in the lives to come, the lives to come, and the lives to come. And he says, consider them and think about their way of life. Think about their outcome of life, because Jesus Christ is doing the same thing now as he did then. And I want you to know, none of us in this room would think we're heroic in any way. None of us would say we're heroes of the faith. But it's not about who we are right now. It's about what we're becoming. And as we are becoming the people of God, every one of us, we still got time, right? We're all still here? We're all still breathing? Good. Some of you might be asleep right now, but we're all still breathing, okay? We still have time in what we are becoming. Consider their outcome, the conclusion of their life. Jesus Christ is still doing that. We're going to sing a song that says he never changes. And the essence of that song is not a theological statement. It's an affirmation that God is still doing in us and through us what he has always done. And do you know that God remembers too? I want to close with just a simple prayer from the book of Psalms. I want to read it for you first, and then we'll pray it together. But the psalmist wrote these words: Lord, remember your compassion and faithful love. They are forever. But don't remember the sins of my youth or my wrongdoing. Remember me according to your faithful love for the sake of your goodness, Lord. It is a powerful thing. He's saying to God, I'd like you to forget the stuff I want to forget. All my sinfulness, all my duplicity. I want you to forget that. And I want you to remember me through the grid of your love, through the lens of your love, or as he says, according to your faithful love. And I think that's a good prayer. There's other passages in the Bible that talks about God throwing the past we're ashamed of, throwing it in the depths of the sea, and God forgetting those things, those sins. And this is all poetic, but you think, can God really forget? Well, I kind of think God is God. He can do anything he wants to do, right? So if he wants to forget, he can forget, I think. But we're saying, would you remember me through that lens of your love? And he does. And remember, when we say, remember me according to your faithful love, remember that to the God of the cosmos, there is nothing more beautiful in his entire creation than you and me. Nothing is more beautiful than that. That's how he sees us. That's how he remembers us. And so would you pray this with me as a prayer? Let me get down so I don't cover up the screen for anyone. Let's pray. Lord, remember your compassion and faithful love. They are forever. But don't remember the sins of my youth or my wrongdoing. Remember me only according to your faithful love for the sake of your goodness, Lord. Amen.